The manager smiled, looked me straight in the eye, and quietly took away my confirmed reservation as if 10 years of memories were worth less than a single swipe of his finger. What he didn't know was that one of the most important guests arriving that evening had been expecting us, and the next few minutes would change every life in that dining room. My name is Tama Tobin, and until that evening, I believed that keeping your dignity mattered more than winning an argument. Ariana, with her fair skin and loose auburn hair, stood beside me while I adjusted the cuff of my dark suit. After nearly 10 years together, the contrast between us was something neither of us thought about unless someone else decided to make it matter. I still believe that. But sometimes dignity means refusing to walk away when someone quietly tells you that you don't belong. The night began with nothing but excitement. I had spent weeks planning a dinner to celebrate 10 years with Ariana Weber, though neither of us usually called the date an anniversary. Technically, it was the 10th year since we first met at a volunteer engineering project rebuilding a neighborhood playground after a severe storm. She had been a law student spending her spring break helping families complete insurance paperwork, while I was a young structural engineer volunteering with my company. We laughed over crooked fence posts, argued about whether hot dogs counted as real barbecue, and somehow never stopped talking after that weekend. 10 years later, she was one of the most respected civil rights attorneys in the city, and I had spent the past decade designing bridges, public transit structures, and community infrastructure across the state. We had celebrated promotions, survived long-distance assignments, cared for aging parents, and learned that love was rarely built through grand gestures. Most of it came from ordinary Tuesdays and quiet conversations after exhausting days. Still, 10 years deserved something special. That was why I reserved a table nearly 2 months in advance at Loran House, the city's most exclusive fine dining restaurant. Getting a reservation there usually required patience, connections, or both. I had neither. I simply planned early, confirmed every detail twice, and smiled when the confirmation email finally arrived. Ariana knew almost nothing about the evening except that she should wear the navy dress she loved, but rarely had an excuse to wear. She laughed when I insisted on wearing a suit instead of my usual sport coat. "You look like you're interviewing for Congress," she teased while adjusting my tie before we left our apartment. "If Congress served steak this expensive, maybe," I answered, earning the eye roll I secretly hoped for every single time. The drive downtown felt unusually peaceful. The late afternoon traffic had finally thinned, and the skyline reflected warm orange sunlight across the river. Ariana rested one hand on mine whenever we stopped at traffic lights, smiling without saying much. She had learned years ago that I became unusually quiet whenever I was hiding a surprise. What she didn't know was that another surprise waited in the inside pocket of my jacket. It wasn't extravagant. It wasn't even jewelry. It was a leather-bound journal containing photographs, handwritten letters, ticket stubs, and little reminders from every year we had spent together. I had left the final pages blank because I hoped we would spend the next decade filling them together. I wasn't planning to propose. We had already talked openly about marriage and agreed that we did not need one perfect moment to define our future. This gift was simply my way of saying that every ordinary day with her had become extraordinary once I looked back. As we pulled into the valet entrance, Loran House looked exactly like every magazine photograph promised. Tall windows reflected the evening lights, polished stone steps led toward oversized glass doors, and neatly trimmed gardens framed the entrance without feeling excessive. Valets moved efficiently from one luxury vehicle to another while guests in elegant evening clothes drifted toward the lobby. Somewhere inside, a charity fundraising dinner was already beginning. We knew the event occupied one ballroom, while regular guests dined in separate sections. The reception was not why I had reserved our table. Rose had asked us to stop by later, but I still wanted the first part of the evening to belong only to Ariana and me. Ariana slipped her hand through my arm as we approached the reception desk. "Happy almost anniversary," she whispered. "Happy every day," I answered. She laughed softly. For one perfect second, I thought the hardest decision left that night would be choosing dessert. Then the man behind the reception podium looked up, studied both of us far longer than seemed necessary, and the smile on his face disappeared before either of us had spoken a single word. The man straightened the cuff of his tailored jacket before offering the kind of practiced smile that looked polished from a distance, but disappeared the moment it reached his eyes. His name tag read Brandon Watkins, General Manager. "Good evening," he said evenly. "May I have the reservation name?" I returned the smile and answered, "Tama Tobin. Reservation for 2 at 7 o'clock." Brandon turned toward the computer terminal, his fingers moving across the keyboard with surprising speed. His expression never changed, but something about the silence felt unusually deliberate. He clicked again, then leaned closer to the monitor as though searching for something that refused to appear. Finally, he sighed. "I am sorry, Mr. Tobin. I do not have a reservation under that name." I felt a brief flash of confusion rather than concern. "That is strange," I replied. "I received the confirmation email 2 months ago." I pulled out my phone, opened the email, and handed it across the reception desk. Brandon barely glanced at the screen before shaking his head. "Unfortunately, our current system does not show an active reservation." Ariana remained calm beside me. "Could there have been a synchronization issue?" she asked politely. "Sometimes confirmation emails are generated before updates finish processing." Brandon gave a small shrug. "Anything is possible, but tonight we are fully booked." His tone remained perfectly professional. His words sounded reasonable, yet something about the conversation already felt slightly off. I noticed the hostess standing several feet away looking toward Brandon with an uneasy expression before quickly lowering her eyes. Brandon returned my phone without another look. "I apologize for the inconvenience." I glanced around the lobby. Several guests waited comfortably near the entrance, chatting while sipping sparkling water offered by another employee. None of them appeared frustrated. "Is there any chance another table might become available?" I asked. Brandon answered immediately, "Not this evening." Before I could respond, the front doors opened again. A white couple about our age entered laughing together. The man admitted almost immediately that they had decided to stop by without a reservation after attending a concert nearby. Brandon's entire posture changed. His smile returned. "Let me see what I can do," he said warmly. Less than a minute later, he handed them 2 menus. "We just had a cancellation in our lounge dining section. If you do not mind waiting 5 minutes, your table will be ready." Ariana and I exchanged a brief glance without saying anything. Brandon had just told us the restaurant was completely full. Now a table had somehow appeared. It could have been a coincidence. Restaurants occasionally received cancellations. I wanted to believe that explanation. Still, a quiet voice in the back of my mind whispered that something was not adding up. Ariana leaned slightly closer to me and spoke softly enough that only I could hear. "Did you notice how he never actually looked at your confirmation?" I nodded almost imperceptibly. She was right. He had dismissed it before reading the reservation number or the confirmation code. That detail stayed with me. It was small, but impossible to ignore. I took a slow breath and returned to the reception desk. "Would you mind checking under Weber instead of Tobin?" Brandon typed only 3 letters before shaking his head again. "Nothing. Could you search using the confirmation number?" I offered. "Sometimes that is easier." Brandon folded his hands together. "Our system does not work that way." I had used enough reservation platforms through business travel to know that most major systems absolutely could search by confirmation number. I did not challenge him. Not yet. Instead, I quietly memorized every word he chose. Ariana gently squeezed my hand, reminding me, without speaking, that losing our patience would only make the evening worse. That was when Brandon looked directly at both of us and said in a carefully measured voice, "Laurent House works very hard to preserve a certain atmosphere for our guests. We simply have standards that must be maintained." The sentence sounded harmless on the surface, but the silence that followed somehow felt much louder than the words themselves. Several nearby conversations faded as people instinctively glanced toward the reception desk. Then I noticed the young hostess looking back at Brandon again, this time with unmistakable concern, as though she knew something that neither Ariana nor I had been told. For several long seconds, nobody said anything. The conversations around the lobby resumed, but they sounded quieter than before, as though everyone had sensed that something uncomfortable had just happened without fully understanding why. I kept my voice calm. "Can you help me understand what standards you are referring to?" Brandon smiled again, but this time the expression felt rehearsed rather than genuine. "Sir, Laurent House has a particular reputation. Our guests expect a refined experience, and management has the responsibility to make decisions that protect that environment." He never mentioned race. He never raised his voice. Every sentence sounded carefully chosen, yet each one carried the unmistakable suggestion that we somehow did not belong. Ariana stepped forward half a pace. Her posture remained relaxed, and her tone was as professional as it would have been inside a courtroom. Respectfully, I am asking a direct question. Are you saying our confirmed reservation is being denied because of something other than availability? Brandon folded his hands behind his back. I am saying that your reservation is no longer active, and unfortunately I cannot change that. Who canceled it? She asked immediately. For the first time since we arrived, Brandon hesitated. It lasted only a second, but I noticed it. I do not have that information, he replied. Ariana nodded. Once, almost as if she expected that answer. Interesting. Brandon looked slightly annoyed by the single word. Is there anything else I can assist you with? Before either of us answered, the same white couple who had entered moments earlier walked past us toward the dining room. The woman smiled politely in our direction, unaware of what had happened. A server welcomed them warmly and led them through the double doors without delay. Brandon watched them disappear before turning back to us. As you can see, we have other guests waiting. His emphasis on the words other guests did not escape me. Neither did the expression on the young hostess standing nearby. She shifted her weight nervously and looked as though she wanted to interrupt, but another employee quietly touched her elbow and shook his head. Whatever she knew, someone clearly expected her to stay silent. That realization settled heavily in my mind. I looked at Ariana. She gave me the smallest nod, silently reminding me that reacting emotionally would accomplish nothing. We had both spent years working in professions where composure mattered. Tonight would be no different. I slipped my phone back into my jacket pocket and smiled politely. We are happy to wait while you verify the reservation one more time. Brandon's smile disappeared completely. That will not be necessary. Why not? I asked. Because my decision is final. Those 4 words landed with surprising weight. A manager refusing to verify a confirmed reservation was unusual enough. Declaring the discussion over without checking anything again made even less sense. I noticed an older gentleman sitting in the lounge area lower his newspaper slightly, watching the exchange with quiet curiosity. 2 women standing near the coat check exchanged uncertain glances. The atmosphere inside the lobby had shifted. People were pretending not to listen while clearly listening to every word. Ariana leaned toward me and spoke softly. Tama, would you please forward me the confirmation email? I looked at her, slightly puzzled, but immediately did as she asked. Within seconds her phone chimed. She opened the message, studied it carefully, and a faint crease appeared across her forehead. Tama, she whispered, look at the timestamp. I stepped beside her. The reservation confirmation showed exactly what I remembered. Then I noticed something I had completely overlooked. Less than 2 minutes earlier, another automated email had arrived from the restaurant. Neither of us had noticed it while Brandon was pretending to search for our reservation. The subject line read, Reservation updated. My stomach tightened as Ariana slowly opened the message, and before either of us finished reading the first sentence, the young hostess suddenly took one determined step toward our reception desk. The young hostess opened her mouth, but before she could speak, Brandon turned toward her with a calm expression that somehow carried unmistakable authority. Susan, he said evenly, Table 12 is waiting at the lounge entrance. Please escort them to their section. She froze for a brief moment. Yes, Mr. Watkins, she answered quietly before stepping back. As she turned away, I noticed the disappointment on her face. She had wanted to say something. Whatever it was, Brandon had stopped it without raising his voice. Ariana continued reading the newly arrived email on her phone. The message was surprisingly short. It thanked us for choosing Lauron House and stated that our reservation had been updated due to operational adjustments. There was no explanation, no new table assignment, and no indication that the reservation had been canceled. Even stranger, the email had been sent only moments earlier, after Brandon had already looked at Ariana and me and begun searching under my name. This does not actually cancel anything, Ariana observed calmly. It only says the reservation was updated. I nodded. Updated to what? Brandon answered before either of us could continue. As I explained, the reservation is no longer available. Ariana looked directly at him. That is not what your own email says. Brandon did not respond immediately. Instead, he glanced toward the dining room entrance where several servers suddenly became noticeably more active. Through the glass doors I caught a glimpse of floral arrangements, camera equipment, and staff members adjusting place settings with unusual precision. The charity event was clearly becoming the restaurant's highest priority. Brandon redirected his attention to us. This evening is unusually busy. I suggest allowing us to accommodate our scheduled guests. His choice of words immediately stood out. Scheduled guests. We had a confirmed reservation. We were scheduled guests. Yet somehow he continued speaking as though we were not. Before I could reply, my phone vibrated inside my jacket pocket. I pulled it out expecting another work message. Instead, I saw a simple text from a contact whose name immediately caught my attention. It read, "We just arrived. Are you inside yet?" There was no additional explanation. I smiled almost instinctively before typing a quick reply. "Not yet." Small delay at the front. I slipped the phone away without mentioning the message to Ariana. There was no reason to complicate the situation until I understood what was happening. At that exact moment, a black luxury sport utility vehicle rolled slowly beneath the covered entrance outside. One valet hurried toward it, while another employee spoke urgently into a headset. The entire rhythm of the lobby shifted. Servers straightened their uniforms. A concierge adjusted his tie. Even guests waiting near the entrance glanced toward the arriving vehicle with quiet curiosity. Brandon immediately stepped away from us without another word. His expression transformed completely. The reserved, dismissive manager disappeared, replaced by someone eager to impress an important visitor. He personally walked to the front doors while several senior staff members followed behind him. Ariana watched the scene unfold. "Whoever just arrived is important," she said softly. "Important enough that he forgot we were standing here," I answered. We remained near the reception desk, neither blocking anyone nor demanding attention. For the first time since arriving, I had the opportunity to observe the restaurant without focusing on Brandon. Employees moved with impressive coordination. Most appeared professional and welcoming. Nothing about the atmosphere suggested a poorly managed establishment. That made Brandon's behavior seem even more unusual. Then Susan quietly passed behind us carrying menus. As she walked by, she lowered her voice just enough for only Ariana and me to hear. "Please do not leave yet," she whispered without slowing her pace. "Someone has been asking for you." Before either of us could turn around or ask what she meant, the main entrance doors opened fully. Brandon's welcoming smile widened, and a familiar voice from outside cheerfully asked the first question that instantly brought the entire lobby to a complete standstill. "Has Tama Tobin arrived yet?" The voice belonged to Rose Hart. Even before I saw her, I recognized the warmth in the way she said my name. Brandon stepped forward immediately with the polished confidence of someone greeting a distinguished guest. "Welcome to Loran House, Miss Hart. It is an honor to have you with us this evening." Rose smiled courteously, shook his hand for only a moment, then looked past him toward the lobby instead of following him inside. "Thank you," she said. "But first, where is Tama Tobin?" I asked my assistant to let him know that I would meet him here before the reception. Brandon's confident expression faltered almost imperceptibly. "Tama Tobin," he repeated. "Yes," Rose answered naturally. "He and Ariana should already be here." Brandon glanced around the lobby as though searching for someone he had never expected to find. His eyes finally landed on me. For a brief second, neither of us spoke. I watched him connect the name with the couple he had just refused to seat. His posture stiffened. "You know Mr. Tobin?" he asked carefully. Rose looked genuinely surprised by the question. "Of course I do. We have known each other for years." She walked directly toward us before Brandon could say another word. The moment she reached us, her face brightened with unmistakable happiness. "Tama." She reached out and hugged me warmly before turning to Ariana with the same affection. "Ariana, it is wonderful to see you again. You both look fantastic." Ariana smiled. "It has been too long." Several nearby guests quietly watched the reunion unfold. The older gentleman who had been reading his newspaper lowered it completely now. Even the servers passing through the lobby slowed their pace. Rose looked from me to Ariana and immediately noticed something was wrong. "Have you been waiting long?" she asked. I hesitated. Before I could answer, Brandon stepped in smoothly. "There was a minor reservation issue, but we are resolving it now." Rose turned toward him. "A reservation issue?" she repeated. "Tama has been on the guest list for weeks." Brandon maintained his professional smile. "Unfortunately, there appears to have been an unexpected system error." Rose studied his face for a moment without speaking. She had spent decades leading successful companies, and I had seen that expression before. She was listening not only to the words, but also to everything they avoided saying. "That is unfortunate," she replied calmly. "Fortunately, those things can usually be verified." Brandon nodded. "We are doing everything possible." "Excellent," Rose answered. "Then I am sure it will only take a moment." The atmosphere inside the lobby became noticeably quieter. Susan had quietly returned behind the reception desk. She was organizing reservation folders, but I noticed she kept glancing toward Brandon with growing concern. Rose looked back at me. "I hope this has not spoiled your evening." I smiled. "We have dealt with more difficult things than delayed dinners." She laughed softly. "That sounds exactly like something you would say." Brandon forced a polite chuckle, though the tension around his eyes was becoming harder to hide. He quickly picked up the reception phone and quietly instructed someone to prepare a table immediately. It was the first time all evening that a table had suddenly become available for us. Ariana noticed it too. She remained silent, but I could tell she was mentally adding every detail together. Rose glanced toward the elegant ballroom entrance where guests were beginning to gather for the charity reception. "Before we go in," she said, "there is something important I wanted to tell both of you tonight." She reached into her handbag and removed a sealed cream-colored envelope with my name written neatly across the front. "I was planning to give you this later tonight, before making the announcement." Before I could accept it, Susan suddenly looked up from the computer screen behind the reception desk. Her eyes widened in alarm, and she quietly whispered words that only Brandon could hear. The color drained from his face almost instantly. Brandon excused himself with an uneasy smile and walked quickly behind the reception desk. Susan turned the computer monitor slightly toward him, keeping her voice low, but the expression on both of their faces said more than their whispered conversation ever could. Brandon's shoulders stiffened as he stared at the screen. He clicked through several windows, then glanced toward us before immediately looking back at the monitor. Rose noticed the change. "Is something wrong?" she asked calmly. Brandon forced a smile that no longer looked convincing. "Nothing serious, Miss Hart. We simply need another moment to organize the seating." Rose nodded politely, but did not move. "Then we will wait together." The sentence left Brandon with nowhere to hide. I remained silent. Years of engineering had taught me that facts always surfaced eventually when people stopped interrupting them. Ariana stood beside me with the same quiet confidence she carried into every courtroom. She was watching people instead of listening only to their words. Susan took a careful breath before speaking to Brandon again, this time just loudly enough that I caught a few words. "The activity log," she whispered. "Timestamp, administrator account." Brandon immediately shook his head, signaling her to stop talking. My attention shifted toward the reception computer. Most restaurant reservation systems recorded every significant change. If Susan was looking at an activity log, then every update to our reservation likely had a recorded time and employee account attached to it. Ariana quietly leaned closer. "I think she found something," she murmured. I answered just as softly. "I think Brandon knows she found it too." At that moment, Rose looked towards Susan with genuine kindness. "Young lady," she said warmly, "would you mind helping us understand what happened? It seems everyone is working very hard to solve a simple reservation question." Susan froze. She glanced first at Brandon, then at the computer, then back at Rose. The hesitation lasted only a few seconds, but everyone nearby noticed it. Brandon answered before she could. "There is nothing further to explain. The reservation was modified automatically." Susan lowered her eyes, yet she did not nod in agreement. That tiny detail spoke volumes. Several guests waiting near the entrance had quietly stopped pretending not to watch. Even the concierge remained unusually still. The atmosphere no longer felt like a routine customer service issue. It felt like people were waiting for someone to tell the truth. Rose crossed her arms thoughtfully. "Automatically," she repeated. "That is interesting, because my foundation reserved nearly 80 seats here tonight, and I have never once seen your system modify a confirmed reservation without documenting exactly why." Brandon cleared his throat. "This situation is different." "How?" she asked. He opened his mouth, but did not answer immediately. The silence stretched longer than any explanation could have. Then Susan quietly spoke. "Miss Hart." Her voice trembled slightly, but she continued. "The reservation was active this afternoon. It was not removed by the system." Brandon turned sharply toward her. "Susan." He did not raise his voice, but the warning was unmistakable. Susan swallowed nervously, then looked directly at Rose instead. The activity log shows that someone manually accessed Mr. Tobin's reservation less than a minute after he and Miss Weber arrived at the reception desk. The lobby became completely silent. Brandon immediately responded. The log does not prove anything. Managers make adjustments all the time. Susan nodded respectfully. Yes, sir. But every adjustment records the employee identification number that performed it. Brandon's face lost what little color remained. Ariana slowly looked from Susan to Brandon without saying a word. I suddenly understood why Brandon had refused to verify the confirmation number from the beginning. He had never been trying to find our reservation. He had been hoping we would leave before anyone discovered it had existed at all. Rose looked calmly at Brandon one final time. Then I believe the next step is very simple, she said. Please show us the activity log. Brandon did not touch the keyboard. He did not answer. Instead, his eyes shifted toward the ballroom entrance where another man in an elegant dark suit had just stepped inside, looked directly at the reception desk, and called out, Brandon, the owner wants to know why our honored guests are still standing in the lobby. The man who had entered from the ballroom approached with measured confidence. He appeared to be in his early 60s, wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that reflected decades of quiet success rather than flashy wealth. Brandon straightened immediately. Mr. Calloway, he said, we are simply resolving a reservation misunderstanding. Paul Calloway, the owner of Loran House, glanced briefly at Brandon before turning his attention to Rose. Miss Hart, I apologize if there has been any inconvenience. Rose smiled politely, but did not soften her expression. Paul, I believe you should hear this directly. Tama and Ariana arrived with a confirmed reservation. They were told it no longer existed. We have since learned that someone manually altered their reservation moments after they arrived at the reception desk. Paul slowly looked toward Susan. Is that accurate? Susan took a careful breath. Yes, sir. The activity log shows a manual modification. Brandon immediately stepped forward. The circumstances are more complicated than that. Paul raised one hand gently. Then I would like to understand every circumstance. Nobody interrupted him. The authority in his voice came from calm confidence rather than volume. He walked behind the reception desk beside Susan and looked directly at the reservation screen. Please show me the activity history. Susan hesitated only long enough to receive a small nod from Paul before opening the system log. Several lines of information appeared on the monitor. Paul studied them carefully without saying anything. Brandon remained perfectly still beside him. The silence lasted nearly half a minute. Finally, Paul asked, one simple question. Whose employee identification is attached to this modification? Susan swallowed. It belongs to Mr. Watkins. Susan hesitated before opening a second record. There is also a note attached to the reassignment, she said. It says the guests did not appear compatible with the atmosphere Mr. Watkins wanted preserved for tonight. Paul's expression hardened. Was that note added before or after they arrived? Susan checked the timestamp. 46 seconds after Mr. Tobin and Miss Weber walked through the door. Several nearby guests quietly exchanged glances. Nobody spoke, but the atmosphere changed immediately. Brandon attempted to recover. The reservation needed adjustment because tonight's charity reception required additional seating. Paul continued reading the screen. Then why does the log indicate the reservation was reassigned rather than relocated? Brandon hesitated. I believe that was the most practical solution. Paul looked up for the first time. Without contacting the guests. Brandon did not answer. Rose quietly folded her hands. Paul, my foundation has been evaluating several venues for a 5-year partnership. Tonight was more than a fundraising dinner. We intended to determine whether this restaurant reflected the values we expect from organizations representing our community. Paul turned toward her with obvious concern. I was aware of the evaluation. Rose nodded. Then you also understand why this conversation matters. Paul closed the reservation screen without another word. He faced Brandon calmly. Did Mr. Tobin or Miss Weber violate any restaurant policy? No. Were they disruptive? No. Did they fail to meet our dress requirements? Brandon looked down briefly. No. Paul waited another moment. Then explain what you saw in Mr. Tobin and Miss Weber that made you decide they were incompatible with the atmosphere of this restaurant. Brandon searched for an answer that never seemed to arrive. His earlier confidence had completely disappeared. Instead of speaking, He looked toward the dining room as though hoping another interruption would rescue him. None came. The lobby remained completely silent. Even employees moving between dining rooms instinctively slowed as they realized something significant was unfolding. Paul finally addressed me directly. Mr. Tobin, on behalf of Laurent House, I sincerely apologize for what you have experienced this evening. Before I could respond, Rose quietly reached into her handbag again and held up the sealed envelope she had tried to give me earlier. Paul, she said, before anyone decides what happens next, I believe everyone here deserves to know why Tama and Ariana were invited to join me tonight. Paul nodded. Please. Rose broke the seal, removed a single document, and as she unfolded the first page, Brandon's expression changed from worry to unmistakable disbelief. Rose held the document carefully, looking first at Paul and then at the growing crowd that had quietly gathered near the reception desk. I originally intended to announce this after dinner, she said. Now I believe everyone should hear it before another word is spoken. She turned toward me with a warm smile that instantly eased some of the tension I had been carrying all evening. Tama has spent much of his career designing public infrastructure that most people use every day without ever knowing his name. Several years ago, when our foundation wanted to rebuild the Hart Community Bridge after structural concerns threatened to close it permanently, every proposal we received exceeded our budget. Tama volunteered hundreds of hours of engineering work so the project could move forward. He never asked for recognition, publicity, or compensation beyond what was necessary to complete the work safely. I felt slightly embarrassed as every eye in the lobby shifted toward me. There were dozens of people involved. I replied quietly. Rose smiled. That is exactly why you deserve recognition. You always credit everyone except yourself. She lifted the document. This evening, our foundation planned to announce that Tama Tobin and Ariana Weber had agreed in principle to help establish a new community initiative connecting engineering, legal advocacy, and neighborhood development. The envelope contains the formal partnership agreement. A quiet murmur spread through the lobby. Paul looked genuinely surprised. That is remarkable. Rose nodded. The initiative represents a multi-year commitment to communities across this region. We wanted tonight to celebrate people who quietly improve lives instead of seeking attention. Brandon stared at the document without speaking. The significance of what had nearly happened seemed to settle across his face. Yet before anyone could continue, Susan took one hesitant step forward. Miss Hart, she said softly, there is something else everyone should know. Brandon immediately looked at her. Susan, this is not necessary. She looked at him respectfully, but did not step back. Instead, she faced Paul. Sir, I need to tell the truth. Paul gave a single nod. Go ahead. Susan folded her hands together, clearly nervous. 3 years ago, my younger brother was seriously injured in a bicycle accident near the Hart Community Bridge during heavy traffic. Before emergency responders arrived, one person stopped, checked that the area was safe, stayed with my brother, and helped keep him calm until the paramedics took over. My family never learned much about him because he left before anyone thanked him. She turned toward me, her eyes beginning to fill with emotion. Last year, I recognized Mr. Tobin in a newspaper article about bridge renovations. I never forgot his face. I blinked in surprise. I remember the accident, I said quietly. Your brother recovered? Susan smiled through obvious relief. Completely. He graduated from college this spring. She took a slow breath. When I saw your reservation this afternoon, I was happy because I wanted to thank you properly someday. Then I watched what happened tonight, and I could not stay silent anymore. The lobby remained absolutely still. Even guests who had no connection to the charity event seemed deeply moved by the unexpected story. Paul slowly removed his glasses, looking first at me and then at Brandon. The kindest guest in this building, he said quietly, was treated with the least respect. Nobody argued with him because nobody could. Brandon lowered his eyes, saying nothing. Rose carefully placed the partnership agreement back inside the envelope before looking at Paul one final time. Now, she said calmly, the question is no longer what happened to Tama and Ariana. The real question is what kind of place Laurent House chooses to become after tonight. Paul looked toward the ballroom doors, then back at every employee gathered in the lobby, and the first sentence of his response immediately made it clear that the future of the restaurant was about to change forever. Paul looked around the silent lobby before speaking with the calm certainty of someone who understood that every employee and every guest would remember this moment long after the evening ended. Loron House has always claimed that hospitality begins with respect, he said. If we fail at respect, then nothing else we serve has any value. He turned toward Brandon. Effective immediately, you are relieved of your responsibilities pending a full review of tonight's events and our reservation records. You will not participate in the remainder of this evening. Brandon lowered his head. He did not argue. He quietly removed the master key card from his jacket pocket and placed it on the reception desk before walking away without another word. No one applauded. No one celebrated. It did not feel like a victory over another person. It felt like the end of a decision that should never have been made. Paul then faced Susan. Thank you for choosing honesty even when it was difficult. Susan looked surprised. I was only trying to do the right thing. Paul smiled gently. That is usually how real integrity sounds. He asked another manager to escort us to the dining room, but Rose lightly touched his arm. Before dinner begins, there is one more announcement I would like everyone attending tonight to hear. Minutes later, the guests gathered inside the ballroom. Paul welcomed everyone, then invited Rose to the stage. Instead of beginning with the foundation's achievements, she told a brief story about quiet service, unseen generosity, and the importance of treating strangers with dignity, because nobody ever knows the full story another person carries. She never mentioned race. She never mentioned Brandon by name. She simply introduced Ariana and me as partners in the new community initiative that would bring engineers, attorneys, educators, and neighborhood leaders together to improve local communities. The room responded with warm applause that felt genuine rather than ceremonial. I accepted the envelope she had carried all evening. Inside was the formal partnership agreement exactly as she had promised. Ariana squeezed my hand beneath the table and smiled the same smile she had given me before we ever walked through the restaurant doors. Somehow, despite everything that had happened, our 10-year celebration still became one of the most meaningful evenings of our lives. A month later, the Heart Community Initiative officially opened applications for its first scholarship and neighborhood improvement grants. Susan accepted an invitation to become the program's community outreach coordinator while continuing her hospitality studies. Paul introduced new guest service training throughout Loron House and the other restaurants his company operated, emphasizing fairness, accountability, and respectful communication. He later wrote me a handwritten letter thanking us for accepting his apology and for giving the restaurant an opportunity to rebuild trust rather than simply walking away. Ariana framed that letter beside the leather journal I had given her that night. The final blank pages were no longer empty. We filled them with photographs from scholarship ceremonies, bridge dedications, neighborhood projects, and countless ordinary moments that quietly became extraordinary over time. Looking back, I barely remember what we ordered for dinner. I remember the conversations, the people who chose honesty when it mattered most, and the reminder that dignity often grows stronger when it is tested instead of when it is easy. Closing reflection, perhaps the moments that shape us most are not always the ones we planned for. Sometimes they begin with disappointment, uncertainty, or an unexpected obstacle that reveals something deeper about the people around us and about ourselves. This story quietly reminds us that respect is often expressed through ordinary choices that may seem small in the moment, but leave lasting impressions on others. There are times when speaking honestly requires courage, and there are also times when remaining calm allows truth to find its own voice. Maybe the greatest measure of character is not found in titles, wealth, or recognition, but in the willingness to treat another person with kindness even when there is nothing to gain in return. Those simple decisions have a way of reaching much farther than we ever expect. I would love to hear what stayed with you after this story. If you found yourself standing in that lobby, what choice do you think you would have made? And what would you hope others remembered about the way you responded?